You picked up your phone to check one thing. 30 minutes later, you're watching a video about how penguins walk, and you don't even like penguins. There's a particular feeling that comes right after that moment, a kind of low, quiet embarrassment. Not dramatic, not sharp, just a vague awareness that time went somewhere, and you're not sure where. And almost immediately, the brain offers an explanation. I have no self-control. I'm lazy. Other people don't do this. That explanation feels true. It arrives confidently, like it's been waiting. But it's wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. And the gap between what people believe is happening when they scroll and what is actually happening is one of the most important gaps in modern psychology. Because this isn't a character story, it's a mechanism story. And once you understand the mechanism, you can't unsee it. Think about the last time you picked up your phone without really meaning to. Not to answer a message, not to check something specific. Just the phone was there and then it was in your hand. Maybe there was a pause in a conversation. Maybe you were waiting for coffee to brew. Maybe you just finished one task and hadn't started the next. And there was this small, hollow half-second of nothing. And the phone filled it. Most people, when asked how often this happens, guess low. They remember the obvious times, the long scrolling sessions, the late nights, but the smaller moments are nearly invisible. The 2-second grab at a red light, the reach for the phone mid-thought before the thought even finishes. The reflex that happens so fast there's almost no decision involved at all. Research on American phone usage puts the average number of daily phone checks somewhere above 140. That's roughly every 6 to 7 minutes of waking life. Not 140 intentional uses, 140 checks. Most of them brief, reflexive, and, if you ask the person 5 minutes later, nearly impossible to recall. That number alone is worth sitting with for a moment. Because if something happens 140 times a day, it's not really a choice anymore. It's a pattern. And patterns have causes. But here's what most people never notice. The majority of those checks don't end in satisfaction. You open the app. You scroll for a moment. Nothing particularly remarkable appears. You put the phone down. And 30 seconds later, you pick it up again. If the behavior were about finding good content, it would stop when no good content was found. But it doesn't stop. It repeats. Which means the behavior isn't really about the content at all. So what is it about? In the 1950s, a behavioral psychologist named B.F. Skinner was running experiments on how animals learn. The setup was simple. A box, a button, a pigeon. Press the button, get food. The pigeon learned quickly. The behavior became consistent, almost automatic. Press, reward, press, reward. Then Skinner changed the rules. He kept the button, he kept the food, but he removed the predictability. Now the food came sometimes, not on a schedule, not every press, just randomly, unpredictably, with no pattern the pigeon could learn. The result was not what most people would expect. The pigeon pressed the button more, not less, much more, relentlessly, in long, driven, almost frantic sessions. And even when the food stopped coming entirely, for stretch after stretch of empty presses, the behavior continued. The pigeon kept going. Skinner called this a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, and in the decades since, it has proven to be the most powerful behavior-shaping mechanism ever identified in psychological research. The reason comes down to something fundamental about how the brain processes uncertainty. Predictable rewards are satisfying, but they're not activating. The brain learns the pattern, files it, and moves on. But unpredictable rewards, rewards that might come or might not, and you won't know until you check, those do something different. They hold the brain's attention in a state of suspended anticipation, a low, continuous hum of maybe, and maybe is extraordinarily hard to walk away from. Now consider the architecture of almost every major social platform used in America today. You open the app, you pull down to refresh. Sometimes there's something that genuinely stops you. A post that makes you laugh, a story that surprises you, something that feels worth the time. But sometimes there's nothing, just ordinary content, familiar faces, nothing that lands. You don't know which it'll be until you look. That uncertainty isn't a flaw in the design. It's not something engineers are working to fix. It is the design. The variability is the mechanism. The not knowing is what keeps the loop running. Every pull to refresh gesture is structurally identical to pressing Skinner's button. The motion, the pause, the reveal. It follows the same sequence that produced compulsive button pressing in pigeons in a 1950s laboratory. Except now it fits in a pocket, it's available every 6 minutes, and the people who built it understood the psychology deeply before they shipped the product. But here's the part that changes how this looks entirely. Most people assume that dopamine, the brain's primary reward signal, gets released when something good happens. You find a funny video, dopamine. You get a like on a post, dopamine. The reward triggers the chemical. But that's not how it works. Neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz spent years mapping dopamine activity in the brain. And what his research revealed was surprising. Dopamine doesn't spike at the reward. It spikes before the reward, in the moment of anticipation, in the space between I might get something and actually finding out. When you open an app before you see a single post, that's when the signal fires. The scroll itself, the motion of looking, the orientation toward what might be there. That's the neurological event. Not finding something good, searching for something good. Which means the brain isn't chasing content. It's chasing the state of looking for content. The anticipation is the product being consumed. And once you understand that, the behavior stops looking like weakness and starts looking like something much more precise. A neurological feedback loop that was deliberately calibrated to sustain itself. This is also why guilt makes it worse. When the scrolling happens and the internal voice says what's wrong with you, that moment of discomfort creates its own tension, a low emotional charge that the brain immediately recognizes as something to resolve. And the fastest available resolution, the one that's already open in the other hand, is the phone. The self-criticism doesn't interrupt the loop, it feeds it. And here's something that almost never gets mentioned in conversations about screen time. The threshold effect. It doesn't start dramatic. Nobody sits down one afternoon and becomes a compulsive phone checker. It builds incrementally below the level of conscious notice, through thousands of tiny reinforcements. Each check that occasionally delivers something interesting slightly strengthens the reflex. Each moment of boredom that gets immediately filled slightly lowers the tolerance for the next moment of boredom. Over time, the gap that the brain can sit with before reaching for the phone gets smaller. Not because the person is weaker than they used to be, because the pattern has been rehearsed so many times that it now precedes conscious thought. The reach happens before the decision. That's not a moral failing. That's how behavioral conditioning works in any system, human or otherwise. Repetition builds automaticity. The brain is doing exactly what brains do when a behavior has been reinforced hundreds of thousands of times. There's a phrase used in behavioral psychology. The environment shapes behavior faster than intention does. What this means in practice is that deciding to scroll less is structurally much weaker than changing the conditions under which scrolling is possible. Skinner's pigeons didn't stop pressing the button because they developed better values. They stopped when the lever was no longer within reach. This isn't about removing phones. It's about recognizing that 140 daily decision points, each one asking the brain to choose the more effortful option, is a design the brain was not built to consistently win. Every check is a moment where the variable ratio schedule gets another turn. Fewer turns changes the math. Something shifts when this mechanism is seen clearly for the first time. Not a dramatic shift, not a sudden resolution or a burst of motivation. Something quieter than that. It's closer to the particular calm that comes from understanding that the problem was never yours to begin with. that the exhaustion wasn't weakness, that the losing wasn't about character. The loop was engineered. The uncertainty was deliberate. The dopamine timing was exploited with precision by people who understood it better than most users ever would. And underneath all the scrolling, underneath all the small reflexive reaches and the lost half hours and the mild background guilt, there was just a brain doing exactly what it was trained to do. That's not an excuse. It's something more useful than an excuse. It's a location. Once the mechanism is visible, once the variable schedule is recognized for what it is, once the anticipation dopamine connection is understood, once the automatic reach is seen as conditioning rather than character, something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. Not perfection, not sudden and total control. Just a little more space between the impulse and the hand. And in behavioral psychology, that space, however small, is where everything actually begins.